I was born on the night of the crimson moon. That's what my mother used to tell me, that the sky bled red the night I came into the world, and the wolves howled so loud and so long that even the river seemed to go quiet just to listen. She said it like it was beautiful, like it was a sign of something. I spent most of my life thinking it was just a story she told to make me feel less ordinary. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a great many things. My name is Seraphine Calloway. I am the daughter of a dead herbalist and a man who walked into the Ashveil Forest one autumn evening when I was 9 years old and never came back out. I grew up sharp because I had to. I grew up without softness because the world around me offered very little of it, and I learned early that waiting for someone to protect you is just a slower way of being left behind. This is the story of the worst month of my life. It is also, and I cannot believe I am saying this, the story of how I found the one person in all the known world I would eventually choose to stand beside. I did not choose him easily. I did not choose him quickly. And there were at least 3 separate moments where I considered stabbing him. But we'll get to that. You need to understand something about Dunmore before any of this makes sense. Dunmore was a village that had learned to be afraid. It sat right at the edge of the Ashveil Forest, close enough that you could hear the wolves on clear nights, close enough that every parent in the village had at some point stood at their doorway in the dark and counted their children before going to sleep. Most people in Dunmore made peace with the fear. They followed the rules. They didn't cross into the forest after the 10th bell. They left offerings at the tree line on the new moon, bread, salt, dried flowers. Old tradition. Nobody questioned it. I questioned everything. I know how that sounds. Difficult. Stubborn. Ungrateful for the pact that was supposedly keeping us all safe. I heard those words applied to me my entire life, and I never once found them convincing. The pact kept us safe. Yes. The pact protected our borders, kept the worst of the wild things out, ensured our harvests weren't decimated by the storms that moved unnaturally through the Ashveil. The pact also killed my father. He'd gone in to find a missing child, little Emmett, Aldrich's nephew, 3 years old, and wandered off during a harvest festival. My father didn't wait for permission. He didn't consult the rules. He just went. They found Emmett on the forest floor 2 days later, unharmed, confused, surrounded by wolf prints. They found my father's knife 3 miles deeper in, half buried in the roots of a black-barked tree. Nothing else. So no, I did not love the wolves. I did not feel grateful for their protection. I felt the particular cold fury of someone who has been told to be grateful for a thing that has also taken everything from her. I ground my herbs every morning, willow bark, feverfew, moonroot, at the same table where my mother had ground hers, and I kept a knife in my boot at all times, and I got through each day by being useful and precise, and refusing to be afraid. That was my life until the Tuesday the messenger arrived. I was in the square when he rode in, dusty, pale, with the look of a man who had delivered bad news so many times it had worn grooves into his face. He unrolled a scroll with the practiced efficiency of someone who has learned not to make eye contact. By order of the Alpha Throne, he read, Lord Caelan Duskmore, sovereign of the 6 pact territories and keeper of the old pact, hereby invokes the bride right. One unmarried woman of Dunmore, between the age of 18 and 25, shall be presented at the Hollow Keep by the next full moon. She shall become the Alpha Bride, bound by blood, protected by Fong, honored above all others. Refusal is not recognized. He rolled the scroll back up. The crowd went very, very still. Then every single head in that square, slowly, collectively, with the synchronized cowardice of people who have already decided someone else should bear the weight, turned toward me. I looked back at them. At Aldrich, at the front of the crowd, doing his best impression of a man with no choice in the matter. I said, no. Just that. One word. I didn't shout it. I didn't cry it. I said it the way you state a fact. The sky is gray today, and I am not going. Aldrich opened his mouth, said something about honor, about protection, about the crops and the children, and the unbroken generations of safety the pact had provided. I reminded him where my father was. He looked at the ground. I walked home. I meant it. I want to be very clear about that. I meant no with my entire body, with every bone and nerve and stubborn cell I possessed. I had not spent 13 years building a life out of nothing to hand it over to a wolf king who thought women were interchangeable diplomatic tools. And then I came home, and I found Petra. She was 14. My sister. The only person left in the world who was mine. Small and loud, and perpetually covered in ink from the books she was always sneaking out of the church library. She had a laugh that sounded like bells dropped from a height. She argued with me about everything and followed me everywhere, and she was, without question, the single most important person in my life. She was lying in her bed with her breath coming in shallow rattles, her lips faintly blue at the edges, her skin the wrong color. I knew what Greylung looked like. I'd seen it twice before. I knew what it did. I also knew, with the terrible precision of a herbalist's daughter, that there was nothing in Dunmore's stores that could touch it. The only treatment for Greylung severe enough to have reached this stage was a compound prepared from deep forest rootstocks. Ashveil rootstocks. Wolf territory. I sat beside her bed for a very long time. I listened to her breathe. And I understood in the cold and particular way that you understand things when you have no good choices left, that I was going to the Hollow Keep after all. Not because Aldrich told me to. Not because the pact demanded it. Not because I had suddenly discovered a fondness for submission. Because my sister was the only thing I had left in the world, and I would walk into the mouth of the forest itself if that was what it took. I pulled my bag from under the bed. I packed my herbalist kit, a change of clothes, 3 days of travel bread, and the knife for my boot. I put it in my belt instead, where I could reach it faster. I left a note for Aldrich. It said, "I am going. Do not celebrate. I will return. And when I do, the pact will be renegotiated on my terms or not at all." I heard later that he had it framed. I choose to believe that was out of fear, and not sentiment. I stepped out into the dark before dawn, and I walked toward the trees. The Ashveil Forest at night was nothing like the forest in daytime. In daylight, it was just trees, dark-barked and ancient. Yes, their roots enormous and half-raised from the earth, but still just trees. In daylight, you could almost forget what lived there. At night, the forest breathed. That is the only way I can describe it. The fog moved between the trunks in slow, deliberate currents that had nothing to do with the wind. The silence was thick and attentive, the kind of silence that doesn't mean nothing is there. The kind that means everything is watching. I had my lantern. I had my knife. I had the specific, furious focus of someone who is too angry to be as frightened as she probably should have been. I walked for 2 hours before I found them. Or before they found me. I'm still not entirely sure which it was. I heard them first, a sound that wasn't quite a sound, more a shift in the quality of the air around me. Then I saw the eyes. Amber, glowing faintly in the dark, arranged in a loose circle at the edge of my lantern's reach. I counted 8 pairs before I stopped counting. None of them were fully shifted. They were something in between, large in a way that made the trees seem smaller, their movements too fluid for men, their stillness too deliberate for animals. They didn't growl. They didn't advance. They simply watched. I stopped walking. Not because I was afraid, or rather, I was afraid, but fear has never been a good enough reason to stop. I stopped because running seemed like the faster way to die, and because I had something to say. "I'm here for the bride right," I said, and I was proud of how steady my voice came out. "I want safe passage to the Hollow Keep, healing salves for Greylung, and a conversation with your Alpha." In that order. The silence stretched. Then the circle parted. And through the gap walked a man. I have thought about that first moment many times since. About what I expected versus what I found. I expected old. I think that's what the stories always give you. The ancient, monstrous Alpha, gnarled with centuries of dominance. The kind of creature that wears a man's shape only occasionally and badly. Something easy to hate. Something that would make the hating clean and simple. Caelan Duskmore was not old. He was not gnarled. He was not, as much as I wished he were, easy to dismiss. He was tall, broad across the shoulders with the kind of lean build that suggests something restless perpetually coiled beneath the surface. His hair was dark and long enough to be unruly. He wasn't wearing armor or a crown or any of the trappings I might have associated with a sovereign. Just a leather vest and worn trousers and boots that had seen a great deal of forest floor. And his eyes. Even in human form, his eyes were amber, not brown, not hazel, but true amber, the color of resin with firelight caught inside it. Old eyes in a young face. Eyes that had seen things and filed them away and forgotten very little. He looked at me the way you look at a fire you didn't start. Interested in the heat. Curious about how far it might spread. "You're the Dunmore girl," he said. "I'm Seraphine," I said. "And you're the man who's been demanding women from villages like they're a crop rotation. We can establish whether we like each other after I get the salves." Something rippled through the pack around us. Several growls, quickly bitten back. He raised one hand, just slightly, barely a gesture at all, and the silence that followed was immediate and absolute. He looked at me for a moment. A long one. "You walked into my forest," he said slowly. Alone. At night. To negotiate. "My sister is dying," I said. "I don't have time to be scared." I don't know what moved across his face in that moment. I've never been able to name it precisely, but something did move.
"Come," he said.
And he turned and walked. I followed.
Not because he told me to.
Because it was the direction I needed to go. The stories about the Hollow Keep were wrong in almost every particular.
The stories said ruin.
Blood-soaked stones, bones in the courtyard, iron cages, the standard inventory of nightmares designed to keep village women obedient and terrified. What I walked into was a fortress that was alive. Torches in iron brackets cast warm light against old stone. The corridors were wide and well-maintained. There were sounds, voices, movement, the distant clang of a smithy somewhere in the lower levels. Pack members moved through the halls in varying states of shift, and every single one of them stopped and stared at me with an expression I can only describe as baffled. I realized, belatedly, that I wasn't walking like a bride. I was walking like I was already calculating the structural layout and identifying the load-bearing walls. Out of habit, mostly. I've always navigated spaces that way. Caelan noticed. "The exits are where you think they are," he said, without turning around. "But the forest is faster than you, so they won't help much." I wasn't planning to run, I said. I was planning to renegotiate. He stopped walking.
Turned.
The full weight of those amber eyes. "The bride right isn't a negotiation," he said. "It's a right." Everything I said is a negotiation. You just haven't met anyone brave enough or foolish enough to tell you that.
Until now.
He held my gaze for what felt like a very long time. I did not look away. Something happened in that moment. I won't pretend it didn't. It wasn't attraction. I want to be very clear that at this point in the story, I considered this man a political abuser who ran a system of forced compliance, and I had not revised that opinion. But something shifted. Some small, quiet thing like a gear catching. Neither of us mentioned it. He gave me the Greylung salves that night. Handed them over without ceremony, without conditions, without even asking me to do anything in return. I said,
"Why?"
He said, "Because sick children shouldn't die for politics." He started to say something else. Stopped himself. Told me I was in the East Wing, and that I was not to go to the lower levels. I watched him walk away, and I thought, I am absolutely going to the lower levels. But first, I held the salves in my hands, and I thought of Petra, and I thought of how she would recover, and I allowed myself exactly 30 seconds of relief before I packed it away and got back to work. The bride right, as I understood it, had 3 requirements. I had to be presented willingly. I had a drink from the Alpha's cup at the binding feast. And I had to accept the mark. I had done the first one, technically, debatably, in the loosest possible interpretation of the word willingly. I refused the second. I refused the third. And I refused every attempt to schedule either of them with the same cheerful consistency one might use to decline a second helping of a dish you didn't enjoy the first time. Caelan did not force the issue. This confused the entire keep. I heard the whispers, not because anyone was careless, but because I was paying attention the way I always pay attention to things people assume I won't notice. She refuses the right, and he allows it. What is he doing? What does she have over him? Who is she? Nobody had an answer, including me. What I did have, in the absence of a ceremony I had no intention of participating in, was time. And the thing about time, when you are someone like me, is that it does not stay idle. It finds things to do. I found my way to the Pax infirmary on the second day. Not because anyone invited me. I found it by following the smell of wound wash and dried herbs, the way you follow a sound you recognize in an unfamiliar city. The healer's name was Marin. She was perhaps 40, compact and capable-looking, with the permanent slight squint of someone who spends a great deal of time examining things in bad light. She looked at me when I appeared in her doorway with an expression that suggested I was both unexpected and entirely the wrong person to be unexpected. "Can I help you?"
she said.
"Probably," I said. "Can I look at your stores?" She let me. I think largely out of the stunned curiosity of someone who had never seen anyone be quite so direct about it. I spent an hour going through her herb stores. I found 3 things she had mislabeled, 2 compounds that had been prepared at the wrong ratios, and 1 storage jar whose contents had gone entirely rancid without anyone noticing. I told her, precisely, with evidence. She stared at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Sit down. I'm going to get us both something to drink, and then you're going to explain to me who taught you." That was how I made my first friend in the Hollow Keep, or close enough to a friend. We were both too practical for the word to fit comfortably, but there was something there. Mutual respect, perhaps. The particular warmth of recognizing a competence you hadn't expected to find. I found my way into Caelan's study on the 4th day. Not by accident. I knocked, once a perfunctory knock, the kind that announces rather than asks, and walked in.
He was at his desk.
Maps spread across the surface, a half-eaten plate of something pushed to one side, the look of a man who had been awake since before I had. He looked up. "Good morning," he said, with a dryness I was beginning to recognize as his version of patience. "Your eastern border wolves are sick," I said. "Whatever they're eating near the salt marsh is poisoning them. I can identify it and correct it, but I need access to your full herb stores and I need someone to take me out to the border." He put down his quill. "Why do you care about my pack's wolves?"
he said.
I opened my mouth, and then I stopped, because the honest answer surprised me. I had spent 4 days in that keep telling myself I was mapping exits and waiting for an opportunity and absolutely not becoming invested in any of the people or creatures within these walls. I had been very firm with myself about this. And yet, I had watched the eastern wolves through the keep's high windows. I had seen how they moved, slower than the others, slightly wrong in the hips, the particular sluggish quality of an animal being slowly poisoned. I knew what that looked like. I had fixed it before in the village dogs, in the livestock. I knew what it cost an animal to suffer a thing you could have prevented. "Because they're suffering," I said. "And I know how to help." That's reason enough. He looked at me for a moment with that unreadable quality he had, the amber gaze that registered everything and gave back very little. "I'll take you to the border myself," he said. That was, in retrospect, a turning point. There is something about working alongside a person in the field, in the mud, in the cold, with a practical problem that requires both of you to think, that strips away the formal distance you've built between yourselves. In his study, in the great hall, in the choreographed tension of our daily disagreements, Caelan was the alpha, and I was the recalcitrant bride, and we both knew our positions. At the eastern border, crouched in the salt marsh reeds with my hands in the soil, and him beside me watching quietly, we were just 2 people trying to solve a problem. I found the contaminating plant within an hour. A marsh creeper that had spread from the southern wetlands, toxic to shifted wolves in concentrated doses, odorless enough that the pack would never have identified it themselves. I pulled samples, identified the spread pattern, worked out a removal strategy. While I worked, the eastern border wolves came closer. Cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence. They were in half-shift, enormous, amber-eyed, magnificent in the way that wild things are magnificent when they choose to let you near them. One of them, the largest, gray-muzzled and watchful, walked up to me while I was kneeling in the mud and put its head in my lap. Just rested there, heavy and warm and trusting. I went very still. And then, because it seemed like the only reasonable response, I put my hand on its head and said, "There you go. You'll be all right." I looked up and found Caelan watching me. There was something on his face I hadn't seen before. Something that wasn't the careful alpha composure or the dry deflection he used when I said something he didn't want to respond to. Something unguarded. Something almost undone. I filed it away. I told myself it wasn't significant. That night, for the first time, we shared a meal that didn't feel like a negotiation or a standoff. We sat across from each other in the smaller of the keep's dining rooms. Just us, no pack members, the fire between us. And we talked. We argued about the history of the pact, about whether the original terms had ever actually been honored, about territorial law and the rights of human villages within pack borders. He was wrong about 3 things and correct about 4, and I made certain he knew the exact count. He pushed back. He didn't capitulate to score politeness points, and he didn't talk over me to establish dominance. He simply argued, like a person who was used to being challenged and had found, unexpectedly, that he didn't mind it. He was, and I want to be extremely clear that I found this annoying interesting. He found me. I could see it, even when he was working hard not to show it something. I didn't name it. Neither did he. But the pack noticed. I know, because Marin told me the next morning with barely concealed delight that the pack had begun referring to me as the one who argues back. In the Hollow Keep, apparently that was a form of respect. I went to the lower levels on the 12th day. I had been planning it since the first night. Not because I expected to find anything dramatic. I'm a herbalist, not a spy, and my expectations were relatively modest. Old records, perhaps. Documentation of previous brides, treatment logs, administrative history. What I found instead was the original pact. It was in the 3rd chest I opened, wrapped in oilcloth, the ink still clear after 5 generations. Written in 2 hands, one cramped and angular, one flowing, on opposite sides of the same vellum, the way a contract is written when both parties have equal standing. I read it by lantern light, sitting on the cold stone floor. I read it twice. And then I sat with it for a long moment because what it said rearranged something I had believed for a very long time. The bride right, in its original form, was not a taking. The Alpha Bride had not always been a symbol or a captive or a diplomatic object. In the original pact, she was a partner, an ambassador. She sat on a joint council that governed decisions affecting both pact territory and human villages. She held veto power over Alpha actions with human consequences. The language was very specific about this, a co-signatory of power, not a possession. Somewhere between the first generation and the current one, the human side of the joint council had quietly dissolved. The veto power had been removed. The co-signatory clause had been struck out and replaced with a single sentence about the bride's ceremonial role. I looked at the handwriting of the strike-through. It was not wolf script. The humans had done it themselves. The village elders, not one generation but several, layer by layer, had traded away the power built for their own women, had surrendered the checks on Alpha authority because unlimited protection with no accountability was simpler to manage than a genuine partnership. They had made us decorative. And they had done it themselves. I was still sitting on the floor when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Caelan didn't say anything when he saw what I was reading. He just looked at me, and then at the document, and the composure on his face settled into something that was close to resignation.
You weren't supposed to find those, he said.
Did you know? I said, yes. Why didn't you restore it? He came and sat across from me. Not at a desk, not in a chair, on the floor, the way I was sitting, the lantern between us. And for the first time I saw something underneath the Alpha composure. Something tired. Something that had been tired for a long time. I tried, he said, 3 times. Formal proposals to the village elder councils, with full documentation of the original terms. 3 refusals.
He paused.
They don't want a woman with veto power. They want a symbol. A story they tell to keep their own people compliant. And the Alphas before you? Thought the current arrangement was efficient.
And you?
He was quiet for a moment. I sent for a bride because the pact requires it, he said. And because the eastern villages were failing their harvests, their safety, things pact protection should have been addressing. The pact was the mechanism. I needed to invoke it to justify intervention. Another pause. And because I thought, if I could find the right person, someone who refused to be a symbol, someone who would walk into the council seat and make it mean something again by sheer force of refusal, I could use the invocation to rebuild what was meant to be there from the beginning. I looked at him. That, I said, is either the most manipulative thing I have ever heard or the most honest.
It is both, he said.
I'm not proud of it. The lantern flickered between us. The stone was cold. Somewhere above us, the keep went about its evening. If I were to agree, I said, carefully, hypothetically, to sit in the council seat with the original powers restored, what would that look like? He looked up, and I saw something cross his face, not triumph, not relief, something more careful than either, something that looked almost like hope. It would look, he said slowly, like what you've been doing for the last 12 days, but with authority to match it. I did not say anything for a long time. The wall I'd built, the one made of grief and fury and 13 years of refusing to be vulnerable, didn't fall that night.
I want to be accurate about this.
It didn't fall, but a crack appeared. A crack I told myself was nothing. I was wrong about that too. Marin came to find me on the 16th day. She came to my room, which she had never done before, and her face had an expression on it that I recognized, the expression of a healer who has found something they wished they hadn't. The particular gravity of unwanted knowledge. She pulled out a vial. Dark, viscous, unremarkable looking. This was found in the Alpha's evening wine, she said. 3 nights running. I looked at the vial. What is it? A lycanthropic suppressant. She set it down carefully on the table between us. In small doses, it's undetectable, tasteless. It mimics fatigue. In continuing doses over weeks, it would strip an Alpha of his shift.
Permanently.
Leave him unable to hold dominance over the pack. Effectively human. Where did it come from? The ingredients were sourced from the village kitchen supply. The order was placed 3 months ago. She paused. Before you arrived. Something cold began to settle in my chest. Who placed the order? She pulled out a second document. Placed it next to the vial. I already knew. I could see it in her face before she said it. I think I had always known, somewhere underneath everything, the way you know a thing you refuse to look at directly. Elder Aldrich, she said, acting as a representative for a coalition of human lords. I picked up the document. Read it. Here is what I learned in that room. On that 16th day, sitting across from Marin with her healer's face and her careful hands. There was a coalition. Not a new one. A decade-old arrangement, quiet and patient, working toward a single goal, the collapse of the pack territories. Not through war. Wolves were too powerful, and a direct assault would fail. But through careful, precise subterfuge. Their plan centered on the convergence, a ceremony held every 50 years, at which all 6 pack territories gathered at the Hollow Keep for the renewal of the Alpha bloodline. Every sitting Alpha, every territorial second, every pack elder, all in one place. If Caelan were stripped of his shift before the convergence, unable to hold dominance, unable to complete the renewal rite, the bloodline would fracture. The 6 territories would go to war with each other for succession. And in the chaos, while the wolves tore themselves apart, the human lords would move in and take the territories piece by piece. They needed someone inside the keep. Someone trusted enough to have access to the Alpha's food and wine. Someone with the herbalist's knowledge to administer the suppressant without detection. They needed a bride. Specifically, they needed a bride who hated wolves, who had reason to comply,
Who could be motivated.
They needed me. I set the document down, picked up the second one, the contract Marin had mentioned, the one that detailed, in careful administrative language, what Aldrich and the coalition had offered in exchange for my cooperation. In exchange for access and information, it read, the coalition agrees to cover all costs of treatment for the Calloway family, including remediation of grey lung infection. I read that line 3 times. Grey lung infection.
Petra.
My sister, who had been perfectly healthy 6 weeks before the messenger arrived. My sister whose illness had been, as far as I had understood it, a terrible coincidence. An act of cruel, random fate that had pushed me into a decision I'd already made not to make. My sister, whose illness had made me desperate enough to comply. They had poisoned her. They had poisoned a 14-year-old girl. My sister. My only family. They had made her sick and suffering and frightened, And they had done it deliberately, as a mechanism of control, to ensure that I would walk into that forest with enough desperation to do whatever it took. They had manufactured my choice. My legs stopped working. Not dramatically, I didn't collapse, I didn't cry. I simply sat down on the floor, because standing required resources I no longer had access to.
They made me the weapon, I said.
My voice sounded far away. Marin didn't say anything. She sat down beside me. She put her hand over mine, briefly, with the quiet competence of someone who has sat with people in the worst moments of their lives. I looked at the vial on the table. I looked at the documents. And something happened in my chest, some last structure that I had been maintaining, brick by brick, since I was 9 years old and my father didn't come home, finally, quietly, gave way. Not rage. Not grief. Something older than both. Something that felt like the moment a wound stops bleeding, not because it's healed, but because the body has simply decided it's time to start. I picked up both the vial and the documents. I stood up. I walked to Caelan's study. I didn't knock. I opened the door, and I walked in, and I put the vial and both documents on his desk without saying a word, and I stepped back, and I watched him read. He read in silence. His face did not move. That precise, controlled alpha stillness he had perfected, the expression that gave nothing away. But his eyes went dark. The amber went so deep it was almost black. When he finished, he looked up. "How long have you known?"
"About 10 minutes, I said.
"I came straight to you." He held my gaze for a moment. "You could have used this," he said. "You could have run. Gone back to Dunmore. Used the documentation as leverage, immunity, safe passage, anything you wanted. They made my sister sick." My voice broke on that sentence. Just once, a small fracture in the middle of the word sick, quickly sealed. But it was there. "They used me," I said. "They used her. They made her suffer, so that I would feel desperate enough to walk in here and do exactly what they needed me to do." I held his gaze. "I am not their weapon. I have never been their weapon. And I am absolutely not going to become it now." He stood. And I saw it, truly saw it for the first time. Not the Alpha. Not the Sovereign. The person underneath. He had taken the throne at 19, after his father's assassination. I know that now, though I didn't know it then. It came out later, in the conversations that followed, in the slow, careful way he told me things he had clearly never told anyone. His father had been killed by the same coalition I was now looking at the evidence of. He had spent 8 years governing a pack that needed a leader while quietly trying to dismantle a system he had inherited and disagreed with, against the resistance of both wolves who preferred dominance and humans who preferred compliance. He had been fighting alone for a very long time. I recognized that. I knew what it looked like because I had been doing it too, just in a much smaller arena. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. I almost laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. Because somewhere in the last 3 weeks, I said, you stopped being my enemy. I don't know exactly when it happened. Somewhere between the border wolves and the lantern room and every single argument about territorial law. I'm very annoyed about it, for the record. He crossed to me in 2 steps. I didn't back away. I wanted a partner in the council seat, he said. I told myself that was all it was. I didn't expect. I said. Don't frame it as a strategy. It stopped being a strategy, he said, quieter now, the night you sat down in the mud and let a half-shifted wolf rest its head in your lap, and you looked at it like it was just an animal that needed care. Not a monster. Not a threat. Just a creature that was hurting. I didn't say anything. I stopped seeing you as a bride candidate around day 3, he said. When you told me everything was a negotiation and didn't flinch when I looked at you. Nobody doesn't flinch. A pause. You did. I had a speech prepared for this moment, or something like a moment like this, because I had been aware it was approaching for several days, and I had been trying to plan for it in the same way I plan for everything. I had a list of reasons. Logical, structural reasons why whatever this was needed to stop before it became something that complicated my exit strategy. I stood there, and I forgot every single one of them. I hate this, I said. I know. I came here to refuse you. I know. I had a plan. Renegotiate the pact, protect Petra, go home. Never think about any of this again. I know. I closed the distance between us. You could have just been a monster, I said. It would have been so much easier. That is not a love confession. I want to be clear. Neither of us said anything as simple as that. But it was the truth, the truest thing I had said since I walked into that forest. And he took it with both hands, carefully, the way you hold something that has been a long time in the offering. We didn't become something uncomplicated. Nothing about either of us was capable of being uncomplicated. But we became something. Something real. Something chosen. Something that neither of us had expected to find, and neither of us, once we found it, was willing to give back. The convergence came 17 days later. All 6 pack territories. Every alpha, every territorial second, every pack elder in the known wolf world, arriving at the Hollow Keep for the renewal ceremony. And with them, because protocol demanded their presence as witnesses of the human pact, a delegation of village lords. Aldrich was among them. I watched him ride in from the upper window of the keep, in his good traveling clothes, with the look of a man who believes he is about to watch something he has worked toward for a very long time finally come to fruition. I let him settle in. I let him wait. And then I walked out onto the steps of the Hollow Keep, and I took my place beside Caelan. Not as a bride. Not as a symbol. As a council member, in the original seat, with the original authority, holding in my hands a newly drafted pact that Caelan and I had spent the last 2 weeks rewriting from the ground up. Signed by Caelan. Countersigned by all 6 territorial leaders, who had, once they understood the full history of what had been removed, been considerably less attached to the existing arrangement than Aldrich's coalition had assumed. Aldrich saw me. His face did something extraordinary. "You were supposed to," he started. "I know," I said. "I know exactly what I was supposed to do." I stepped forward. I had my herbalist's bag with me. I also had copies of every document from the lower levels of the keep, the suppressant vial with full documentation of its chain of custody, and the signed testimonies of 3 coalition lords who had chosen, once they saw the evidence against them, that cooperation was considerably preferable to the alternative. I addressed the gathered assembly, lords and pack leaders together, all of them watching, the silence of the convergence square as complete as I had ever heard. There was a plan, I said. A decade in the making. A coalition of human lords who intended to use the bride right as a mechanism to weaken the Alpha before this convergence, fracture the pack succession, and take the territories in the chaos that followed. They chose their weapon carefully. A herbalist. A girl with reason to hate wolves. A girl who could be made desperate enough to comply. I held up the documents. They made my sister sick to ensure my compliance. They poisoned a child. And they did it in the name of protection, the same protection they've been using for generations to justify stripping women of every power this pact was originally written to give them. I looked at Aldrich. The evidence, the contracts, and the full coalition member list are now in the possession of all 6 Alpha representatives. Anyone involved will be named and dealt with under both human and pack law. That is not a threat. That is the restoration of the pact functioning as it was designed to function. I paused. "I didn't come here as a bride," I said. "I came here for my sister. And I am remaining, by my own choice, with full authority, as a partner in this council, because for the first time in a very long time, I found something worth building." I looked at Caelan. He looked back at me with those amber eyes that give very little away, and in them I saw the thing I had learned to read, the thing underneath the composure, warm and certain and entirely, stubbornly mine. I stayed. I need you to understand that, because I think people expect a story like this to end with a ceremony. A mark. A beautiful binding moment where the woman surrenders something and the man claims her, and everyone agrees this is romantic. That is not what happened. What happened is that I stayed because I chose to. Because I examined every option available to me, and I concluded, with the same precise, stubborn logic I apply to everything, that this was the one I wanted. This place. This work. This man who argued back and didn't flinch and had been quietly trying to fix a broken system from the inside for 8 years before I walked into his forest and decided to help. The pack started calling me the Thorn Bride. Not because of the ceremony. The ceremony, eventually, was held on our terms entirely, renegotiated from scratch. Nothing in it that either of us hadn't explicitly agreed to. They called me the Thorn Bride because of the way I had grown into that place. like a thorn growing into stone, persistent, unrelenting, permanent. Caelan never called me the Thorn Bride. He called me Seraphine. My full name, always, in a voice that made it sound like something he had decided to be careful with. Petra recovered completely. She came to the Hollow Keep 6 months later to visit and declared, within an hour of arrival, that she wanted to train with the Pack Archivist. She has been there ever since. She argues with everyone constantly. I have never been prouder of her. The coalition was dissolved. The pact was restored. The Joint Council was reinstated with full powers, with representation from every human village in the territories and a standing veto on alpha decisions that affected civilian life. It was not perfect. Power never produces perfection. But it was real, messy, and functional, and built by people who had chosen it, and that was more than it had ever been before. And every year, on the night of the Crimson Moon, the anniversary of my birth, and the night I walked into that forest with a knife in my belt and fury in my chest, and no idea at all what I was walking into, the wolves of the Ashveil howl until the rivers go quiet to listen. Not out of warning, not out of grief, out of joy.